The film was made on a very small budget, and the composer, Paul Giovanni, figured that he might save a bob or two if he were to use students as his core musicians rather than musicians' union members. He was unaware, actually, that students were also musicians' union members, and the way that it worked was that even if you used students, you still had to abide by musicians' union rules and regulations. But that was after he'd actually been engaged. So what happened was that he contacted all of the conservatoires in London. That's the Royal Academy, the Royal College, presumably the Guildhall. At that time, only the Royal College of Music had a careers office that actually did anything to promote students' work. And the woman running that was of the opinion that it was too much of a commitment for a full-time student. So she suggested that he contact someone who had just left. And she spoke to my then just ex-composition teacher, John Lambert, who had had a considerable amount of experience working in the theatre, and he thought that I might be the right person for the job. So I was contacted and had to go round to Peter Schaffer's house, which is where Paul was billeted. And basically I played some music, talked to him about what I've been doing, told him that I knew the kind of people who might be good for this particular gig. And we took it from there. We used to meet at Paul's place, or rather at Peter Schaffer's place in Earl's Court. Paul would introduce the songs, we'd knock them together. Some of it I would actually physically arrange. Sometimes we'd do head arrangements. Paul had a pretty clear idea at all times of what he was after and what he wanted. So although he couldn't read music, which was why I was useful, in fact not all the band could either, nevertheless he was so precise and very clear about his intentions and how he planned to actually put the score together, that really it was just a question of being partly amanuensis, but also throwing in ideas, notating, that sort of thing. Paul had a very specific aesthetic about recording songs, which was that everything was close mic'd and everything was sung in a half voice. So in other words, there was no projection. He never wanted projection. He always wanted this kind of close. And it's actually a very, very modern way of recording. He was actually very keen when, for example, with the guitar, I mean, people in those days used to try their level best to get rid of any sort of dirt or distortion or scratching or anything that was actually inevitable consequences. For example, of playing a guitar, finger noise. Paul liked to record it so that you could hear the finger noise going up the fretboard. So it gives it, and which again has become sort of a much more fashionable, popular way of recording, keeping some of the grit and the dirt, particularly in the digital age, actually, where digital recording is so perfect that getting a kind of grungy effect is sort of like harking back to the good old days of stuff sounding like crap. You know, I mean, it was that sort of thing ahead of its time. So the recordings didn't sound like crap, I hasten to add. They just sounded very natural. And the little shifts and the sound of the finger movement and the odd little buzz on the strings of the Nordic lyre gave it a real feel.
I put my hand on her belly and she says, do you want to fill me gently, gently?
The music was recorded at Delane, well, it was recorded in 2 or 3 areas. The first recordings was at Delane Lee's studios in Wembley, which I don't think exists anymore. Certainly not in that format, and certainly not under that name, because it changed. It was a 16-track recording, at a time when 16-track was very, very innovative, 1972. I mean, bear in mind that's only like 2 or 3 years after the Beatles recorded their last album, and they were still on 4-track, possibly on 8. But that would have been pushing it a bit. So it was state-of-the-art. Some of it, notably the young girls dancing around the stones, the fire jumping sequence, was actually recorded at Pye Studios near Marble Arch. And all the post-production recording, the incidental music, was recorded at Shepperton Studios One of the things that's unusual about the soundtrack for the film is that it's a kind of top-down, down-up kind of approach. All the musicians that are visible on the film are in fact the musicians that did in fact play the soundtrack in the studio, and all the musicians that you see on the film, bar the ones that, for example, like trumpets and the orchestral instruments, if you like, were actually soundtracked by the same musicians. So it has a quite sort of intense diegetic quality about it, so that even the non-diegetic music, the incidental music that accompanies scenes, because it's played by the same musicians you see on stage, it brings an extra area of kind of like hyper-reality to the way that the piece progresses, which is why I think, we didn't think of it in those terms, it wasn't an academic treatise, but in reality that's the way that it works, and I think it brings an intensity to the film that would not be the case where, for example, you know that there's a bunch of orchestral players who'll be down the pub when the session's over, providing the musical soundtrack. In fact, there's an integral quality about it.
Much has been said of the strumpets of yore,
of wenches and bawdy house queens by the score, but I sing of the baggage that we all adore. The landlord's daughter, you'll never love another, although she's not the kind of girl to take home to your mother.
Her ale it is lively and strong to the taste.
I've always listened to film music. To me, it's more important than the films. So, at the time, in the sort of late 80s, I'd been listening to loads and loads of sort of classic film music, you know, especially the 60s, sort of Henry Mancini, Lalo Schifrin, that kind of thing. And I'd gone on a mission to find as many strange and interesting film music records as I could. And when I heard The Wicker Man, it's quite wistful and a bit magical and a bit scary. And that sort of lit a bit of a fire in my brain. I started getting quite determined about doing it. And so it was a case of phone calls, faxes, going to see people, knocking on doors, going to Pinewood, trying to speak to people who knew more about it or might know about Paul Giovanni, and just trying to sort of put together a bit of like detective work, put together a sort of picture, like one of those big boards you see on detective films where you've got the Wicker Man soundtrack at the top and then all these little wires coming off it, and you're trying to find out eventually who can give you permission to do it. We found out through Canal Plus that the rights were owned by Paul Giovanni, so then I had to go and try and find Paul Giovanni, and he was dead, which made it a bit difficult, and he left no estate. And so I then went back to Canal Plus, and who are obviously based in France, and just started speaking to them. And it was one of those things where you'd have to phone up or fax. There's no internet in those days, or write letters. And I remember phoning this one number I'd been given by someone who said you could get permission from this person. And I kept ringing this number, and every day no one ever answered it. And then one day someone answered it, and I spoke to them, and I just said, "Look, this is the situation. The soundtrack is from this film. You own the film. The recording is non-existent. There are no master tapes as such, no real master tapes as such. I've spoken to the people at Pinewood. They have what's known as a music and effects tape, which is a set of 13 of those." And what I want to do is make 1,000 copies of that recording, issue it on vinyl, just 1,000. And what we'll do is we'll keep the royalty for Paul Giovanni, or the estate of Paul Giovanni, if as a result of doing this, it flushes them out of the woodwork. That was it, really. And they went, yes, okay, fine. So I thought, right, okay, there's permission from the people who own the film to let me go to Pinewood, get the M&Es, do the transfer. So within about 2 weeks, we had this van drive these 13 huge reels, and they're massive, these M&E tapes. They're like really old-fashioned, big, fat 2-inch tapes, into the only place in Soho that could transfer these huge, fat old tapes onto DAT. And from there, we compiled it into this sort of sequence which goes along with the film.
In the woods there grew a tree, and a fine, fine tree was he.
Sold out extremely fast, and I think within a month it was in the back of a magazine, Mojo I think it was, who used to run this collectible thing at the back, saying it's now worth 200 quid, which considering you could buy it for $7.99 a week before was a bit nuts. There's 500 black vinyl, then 500 red vinyl with a map, which was Dave Lally's map. Dave Lally was the chairman of the Wicker Man Appreciation Society and knew probably more about that film than anybody else. He'd even got props from the film and stuff like that. I mean, he knew the film back to front, and was fascinating. And he drew me this map of the Wicker Man tour you could do, of all the locations in Scotland where the film was shot. And then he got a bit angry because I did, because he did. I didn't actually get permission to photocopy it, so he got a bit angry. Even though I put at the bottom, map courtesy of, so I had to send him another copy of the record and say very sorry.
Been a CD release by Trunk Records, which was just basically lifting the soundtrack off the film and putting it out in, rather gross mono. I mean, it was a bastardisation, really. It had no reflection of what the film soundtrack was like. So basically, I kind of used the net to let it be known that the thing was available, was around. The history of that is that after the film had wrapped, Paul Giovanni, we'd got the mixes, the stereo recordings of what he would like as a soundtrack, as an original soundtrack album. So we went into the Delane Lee Studios, and he put together an 8-track album, 4 tracks on each side. Basically, which is effectively the first 8 or 9 tracks, really, of the release out, what eventually ended up to be the CD release. And they were mixed in stereo, bounced to 30 IPS, 1 7.5 IPS copy was made of the master, and I requested that copy. I mean, it was made for me to keep as a sort of, an item to keep. And that sort of kind of went with me all over when I lived in Europe, I had it in the bottom of my suitcase. So it literally travelled everywhere with me. Now, the interesting thing is that it was the only copy of the soundtrack in stereo that anybody could trace. But I could do nothing with it, obviously, because it was, it's not my copyright. It was the copyright of British Lion Music. British Lion Music had functionally ceased to exist and passed into the hands of a chap called John Craig, who runs a record company called First Night Records, as part of his redundancy deal when British Lion was broken up, because he used to work for British Lion Publishing at the time. So basically he owned the copyright, I had the hard copy. He could do nothing with it because, I had the hard copy. I could do nothing with it because I owned the copyright, because I owned the actual physical tapes. So basically we just came to an agreement that would sort this out to have, be mutually beneficial. We digitised it, basically. That was through the good offices of David Fanshawe, the composer and a good friend of mine, sadly no longer with us, who actually had an oven that could actually that could bake tapes, because in the tapes from those days needed to be baked before they could be played, because otherwise the oxide would come off on the heads and you'd never be able to play them again. So he actually did all the kind of the grunt work on getting them up to a sort of standard whereby they could be satisfactorily transferred onto DAT. And that's the basic history of how that particular CD came into existence.
I've not listened to the one we did for years, only because I got to the stage with it where I was completely utterly obsessed by it. When I'd issued it, the last thing I wanted to do was hear it again, because I'd become so sort of close to it.
Amazingly, actually, they don't date. I don't think that they lose their immediacy through the passage of time.
I think it glues it all together. I really do. I think it would be quite a normal horror film, but with the music, it gets so much more sinister, because the music sort of amplifies the feelings of being in this weird rural commune, but also it sort of enhances the sort of sex and the paganism.